Hiring the right people. God, it's I've made some pretty silly old mistakes in hiring over the period, and I think if I reflect on some of the mistakes, and they're not bad people, I just hired them for the wrong roles, right?
Have founded startups, it's their first time, not always, right, but certainly with a lot of the organizations that I'm working with. So, make sure you work, either in a professional or personal, or have a strong network of people that have been there, seen it and done it before, that you can talk to and work through stuff. The mistakes hurt you more than anything. So, do everything that you can to try and avoid them.
Welcome to GrowthPulse, the B2B sales podcast. You might be a salesperson. You could lead a sales team. Maybe you run a business or you're a battle-tested entrepreneur. Then we built this podcast for you. Great salespeople are built, not born. We learn so much from the deals we win, but we learn even more from the deals we lose. In each episode, we bring you some of the world's leading salespeople, sales leaders, and experts in sales tech to share their best lessons from both their wins and their losses. Before we start, please check out the screen of your phone or laptop, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you've clicked subscribe and press that like button down below. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, click the plus sign to follow so we can let you know when we publish each new episode. If you like the episode, drop us a comment with any questions about the show. We'd love to get to know our audience. Great businesses always feature world-class salespeople, and the best salespeople are always learning. So let's jump in. Welcome everybody to another episode of GrowthPulse, the B2B sales podcast. I'm Dan Bartels, one of your co-hosts, and I'm here with Simon Peterson. Mate, welcome back to another show.
G'day, Dan. Great to be here. I'm really looking forward to today's show. We're going to talk with Mark, which is going to be awesome.
Mate, we've got a great guest, Mark Randall. Mate, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Mate, we are so excited. You've got a phenomenal background that sort of really drew my attention to a lot of stuff you've done. You posted on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago and talked about the fact that you've been in some amazing businesses that have gone from a startup through to IPO. And having done that multiple times, that's a really unique mix. And having done it also working in APAC, that's a piece that Simon and I have had a bit of experience in running sort of running software companies or technology companies in APAC, and there's a really different flavor to it. Now, mate, so I want to make sure I absolutely go through your resume correctly. So I'll give it a bit here, but the key businesses, you ran Rackspace from kind of zero to IPO and then ran WP Engine. And that's correct, isn't it? They're the two businesses that you ran.
Yep, absolutely. And I was not running their local operations in Australia and APAC, but between those two, sandwiched was Bulletproof as well, which also listed on the ASX, where I headed up the go-to-market function. So, yeah, been involved in those go-to-market roles in last four organisations, and three of them so far have gone to IPO.
And now you're running a company called Australia Go-to-Market. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And look, tell me all about Australia Go-to-Market for our listeners. I mean, obviously, I'm assuming it does what it says on in the name and the brand. But tell us about the business.
Yeah, well, it's very different to what I've been doing for the last 20 years or so. Working for local tech companies and setting up global tech companies in the APAC region. Australia Go-to-Market is basically me. Right now. So I'm providing go-to-market expertise, consulting, recommendations, and a little bit of ongoing, kind of head of sales, CRO, support on a part-time basis to both local startups and also with the intention of supporting global tech companies with their expansion into this market. So it's new for me. I've only been doing it for the last two or 3 months, but I'm fully occupied, which is good. So the first challenge is done, which is fill your time, and looking forward to continue building it out and scaling it next year.
Mate, that's exciting. And I think, look, it's an interesting piece that you're sort of targeting there, which is how do either Australian software companies who are wanting to grow and expand, but also overseas organizations come into region. And again, I mentioned at the top of this, it's a piece that Simon and I have talked about privately a lot. And it's a very different skill set, particularly when you're bringing an organization out into the region, how to actually, approach that, how to grow it properly, how not to scale too fast. Like that can be a real challenge as well. So we definitely wanted to delve into that, because I think there's a lot of people that listen to the podcast who are either going through some of those challenges. They might be an AE, they could be leading a team, they could be asked to be first on ground. So you're given that role of do all those things under that banner all at the same time.
Yeah.
So I want to delve back into your kind of experiences. How are things given to you when these key roles? Had different sized teams. Like, take us through that experience of the first couple of those types of roles, or the conversations you had. How was it kind of positioned to you when you took on those early roles?
Well, they've all been different, of course, and different scenarios, and I've been there at different stages of the journey and had different levels of influence over the outcome, of course, as your career progresses, and you tend to have more senior roles over time. It's kind of interesting. If you mentioned Rackspace, which was the first one, and one of the roles that I've really enjoyed in my career, where I was first in region. The business was established in the US, was established in Europe, but had nothing in Australia or APAC. In that situation, they'd actually already made the decision to expand into APAC, but into Hong Kong. And they'd invested in a data center in Hong Kong and had built a sales team out there. And Australia wasn't really on the radar. And because I'd had experience here, I'd actually moved back to the UK, where I joined Rackspace originally in Rackspace UK. But previously, I'd been working for a company in Australia that had been in the hosting space, as well as domain names and business broadband and those types of things. I had experience of the market, and I knew there was an opportunity here. So, I kind of convinced them, if you like, that, they should, give me a go when I relocated back here. Obviously had the experience with the business already, which was hugely beneficial and helpful. But really, I say to people, they sent me with, a laptop and a good luck card, essentially. I was on my own. There really wasn't a lot of support. We didn't even have a data center in the region to sell. So, we had to go out and find, whatever niche we could, which essentially was, Australian-based businesses that did most of their had most of their customers overseas, because that's the only place we had data centers that we could serve them for. So he carved out that niche and did quite well with some Kiwi SaaS companies and other people that are very internationally focused in terms of their sales and marketing, of course. And then eventually built a business case to invest in the data center and scale the business from there. WP Engine, which is my most recent full-time position, that was very different. They had already decided that they were going to move and expand into the Australian market, having expanded successfully into EMEA around 18 months before. So, what they asked me to do was essentially put together a go-to-market plan from day one to build out a team and actually build it into a real business from the get-go. So they were both, 0 to, 50 million in one case, 20 million in another case, kind of journeys, building the team up from, 0 to 50 to 100 people. But they both, are very different in terms of how they started, I guess.
So many times where you're given, and you called it, you're given a laptop and a business card and gone out to lead your success. I mean, so when we've done these engagements, like, how do you think about it in terms of what the real task to do is? I mean, what are we trying to describe to people here?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one, because you've in our case, and I think, Mark, your case, they're US-based companies. They've done reasonably well. They're used to working in a market with many times the size that we deal with in Australia, and typically they've got a reasonable culture built and a way of doing things. And I think the challenge for coming out certainly to Australia and to Asia in general is you've got a product that's fairly similar in the US, the UK, Australia, Asia, etc. But the way companies in Australia buy is fundamentally different. And I think you've got to merge what's great about the existing culture, understand the culture of your buyers, and somehow bring them together. And I think the other big one is the talent pool in Australia is quite different to the US. I mean, obviously it's a much larger market, and they're very used to finding the right people very quickly. And I think you find here that in general, I've found that, American business leaders, now we speak the same language, so we must be the same. And we're probably more similar than not, but it's the nuances of where we're different that's going to make you a successful growth engine down in this region. And I think, so with same but different is probably the best way to describe it. But, Australians in general hate being sold to. And I think you take the methods and the processes, etc., out of an American company. You've got to understand. You've got to tweak some of the marketing. You got to tweak, how you treat employees. And I think employment law is fundamentally different. And as simple as that, those sort of things. Educating, our masters in HQ around what's different. And I think if you can't articulate that as first on ground or early on ground, you're always trying to play catch up. I don't know, Mark. What are your thoughts? You've been through it a couple of times.
Yeah, very aligned to yours. So, there's differences, and I think, the key thing really is to make sure that you've got control over the things that you need to have control over in order to get success. And if you can't have control, to make sure that you've got very strong support in place, because as you say, like, the same things don't work. People buy differently. One of the buying behaviors I think that's quite pronounced is, I think buyers in the US, and this is reflected in the kind of marketing materials that tend to proliferate, they don't tend to be quite as in depth in terms of their research as Australian buyers. So a lot of the marketing falls short because, it's very high level. It doesn't provide any of the details that people actually need, to educate themselves about, your offering and make an informed, comparison and choice. And I think, that's one small difference. I think the team, again, as you said, is or how you motivate people is very different. We've had, people, in my organization, so obviously other sales leaders and so on come over from the US, and some understand instinctively that it's different, other people don't, and kind of initially kind of wondering, why aren't people like jumping on the tables when they win a deal? And it's just some of those things are just different. And as I say, the culture of an organization is super important. I was really fortunate in both global companies that I worked for, that they had a very strong culture. They had very strong leadership. And, to a large extent, I was trusted to go and do what I'd been hired to do. And, my feedback was taken on board. In fact, almost the opposite, in the early days of Rackspace, because it was kind of an afterthought and it was kind of initiated by me rather than the company. We were kind of just under the radar for the first 2 or 3 years. And it was only when, the investment in the data center was made that actually anyone really paid attention. So that kind of meant you could actually just get on with doing things, the way you needed. But WP Engine was very different. As I say, it was a plan from the start. There was, a lot of oversight and support. But at the end of the day, you can't always get all the things that you want. So I think experience is one of the things that helps guide you in knowing where you need to push to make sure that you can execute effectively.
And I think, Mark, what you're talking about there is the mindset of when you're running a region, whether it be for a startup or you're running it for a global organization expanding into, they're both startups. And I think this is this piece that so many global leaders, when they're looking at a region like Australia, we're on the other side of the world. We operate most of the time when you're asleep. We need to be able to be self-sufficient. Decision making needs to be for so many things that you have distributed decision making for overseas, whether it be in EMEA or North America. You don't have that, so it all gets channeled back into a small number of people, which is really similar to a small startup. And unfortunately, often you're part of an organization that is much, much more mature, but your customers have no idea who you are. And the marketing messaging, they've never seen it before. You take Rackspace as an example. When you launched, it wasn't a brand name that anyone from an IT perspective who had only lived in Australia would even be concerned about, because there was no presence here. There's no, whether we're at the same level of maturity, it's just not going to be there. So all of these key things where the messaging kind of falls short, is that it's back to a startup. You're in that sort of early part of the S curve. How did you navigate kind of those experiences, and how do you communicate that back to your leaders as to where you are comparative to where the business is at? Because I know that's something that we've kind of been through that process, but I think everyone has a bit of a different flavor on how they go about doing it.
Yeah, I think I was fortunate in many ways in that the people that I worked with had largely experienced that before, from the perspective at least of being in the US and being in a senior VP of sales roles for a global tech company, or in the latter stages of my time at WP Engine being head of international out of London. They'd had experiences of setting up remote regional teams as well. So I think that helped a huge amount. The other thing, and I think you're right 100% about it being a startup, but it's a very different type of startup as well, right? There's good and bad in both. I mean, I've done two, roles very early stage with Australian-based, tech companies as well on similar growth journeys, and without doubt, the two US ones are similar in many ways. The two Australian ones are similar in many ways. The global and Australian ones are not very similar at all, other than the fact that they're both startups. The problems are different. The challenges tend to be different. With the global tech companies, you often find that most of your battles that you're fighting are internal, if you like, right? You're trying to get support. You're trying to get, things changed, to suit the local market need. You're trying to make sure communication is there. You're trying to make sure you can get resources for training and other things that, aren't within, your team's capability, or you're not resourced to do. Locally, with Australian companies, you tend to have that very, fast decision making. You don't have any barriers internally, but you don't have as much money, and you don't have as much resources, and things that you can go out there and use. You have to kind of build everything from scratch. And personally, I think that experience of having done both has been one of the things that's been hugely helpful and beneficial to me, because I've had, I guess, enough of the startup experience, to be able to apply that in a global tech company. But I've also had enough experience of, how businesses scale, like how you scale departments and teams and KPIs and go to market in general, up to, thousands of people in a much larger global organization, because I've been part of those organizations. So, that's kind of in many ways what I'm trying to do now, I guess, in my role at Australia Go to Market is, bring that, experience of having, seen what scale, what good looks like at scale, and bring that and make that available to smaller tech companies that maybe don't have, or to an earlier stage, to have that expertise, experience, or to be able to bring people on board, full time in those roles.
Yeah, exactly. And Mark, obviously it takes a special kind of salesperson to join a startup. You've probably worked with AEs that really thrive in the mega software companies like the Salesforces, the Oracles, and the SAPs, and then there's a different type of salesperson that thrives in the startup environment. What's your take on, if I'm an AE listening to this and I really want to go work for a startup and I see growth, what are some of the key attributes of a salesperson that you look at and say that's the kind of person who will thrive in this environment?
Yeah, I think resourcefulness, number one. In a much larger company, if you look at the full spectrum of things that lead to go-to-market success, as an individual sales contributor, you're probably responsible for 5% of them. Right, you've got marketing teams that do things for you. You've got customer success teams that do things for you. You've got leadership and employee experience teams that do things for you. In a true startup, like an early stage startup, like a seed, Series A, the type of organizations that I'm working with now, they don't have those things. So you need a much wider range of skills. You need to be very resourceful. You need to be a self-starter. When I built out my early teams, I was always looking, experience is important, but I would rather have had a team of like highly motivated self-starters that are resourceful, that have something to prove, than have people with 10 years experience on their CV, because those are the types of people that, bond together as a team, that collaborate, that, get shit done basically, and are willing to turn their hand to anything.
So when you use the terminology self-starter, right? I think this is, we're all sales leaders on the podcast today. And I think it's a term that we use regularly. And often, if you're an AE, you're wanting to, you're early in your sales career and you hear that, what does that mean to you? And I think someone will ask the same for you after this. But like, to me, it means someone who is just focused on getting to the outcome. And I think it's a key skill for salespeople, which is, I've got a quota, I've got to resolve a problem, and I'm not going to take no for an answer. And sometimes it won't be I'm belligerent about how I want to do it. It's I will find a resolution to the problem, no matter what roadblocks are put into me. So Mark, when you kind of look for a self-starter, like what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think, drive is one part of it, but I think there's more to it than that. I think, the resourcefulness is a key part of that. The independence, being able to think independently and act independently. In a small startup, you're not going to get a lot of time and attention from everyone. Things aren't going to be perfect, and in fact, most things won't be perfect. And you've got to be able to navigate that. And, in order to do that, you need to be resourceful, you need to be adaptable, and you need to have the drive that you spoke to as well.
Simon, what do you reckon? Self-starter, mate. When you look at your team, what are the features that you're looking for in someone who's a self-starter?
Look, I guess to Mark's point, early stage startup is, I guess, chaos, basically. The job you're hired for is very seldom the job you do about a week into it. Things come up, your product's not ready, or the market's not there, or the marketing engine isn't ready. You don't have a lead system to drive activity. And I think if you come out of a big organization where there's well-trodden processes, there's systems for everything that can possibly go wrong, the person that thrives just doing that tends to just follow the process and push things through the sausage factory a little bit. I'm certainly not degrading salespeople that work for large organizations, but there is a tendency to, you've got a crutch that you can fall on because there's 3 or 4 other people that can come in and do the demo, or there's a process for this, a process for that, etc. And I think early stage startups, there are no processes, right? So you've got to be comfortable with the absence of certainty. Is probably the best way to describe it. And if you come in on a Monday morning and you expect to know what's actually going to happen that day, because that makes you feel happy, an early stage startup is probably not the environment that you'll thrive in. But some people absolutely love that stuff, right? You have to be a good seller regardless of where you are. But the people I find that thrive in these small teams, they're very creative. They really empathize with the customer because there's not a track record of references you can call on. So you need to build quite that special relationship. You need to focus on building those lighthouse accounts that you can then build on, and that's a special type of person. It may be maybe 6 months before you get your first deal. And so as a leader looking at those sort of people, it's not 2 quarters of failure and you're fired. It's I'm investing in this business and I'm investing in the people I've hired. So it's a slightly different cadence, I think, and you've got to be used to it and comfortable with it.
I think the blend of people within the team is so important as well in those like early stage in environments as well, like diversity in its broadest sense, right? Having people from, a range of different skills, backgrounds, experiences, because when you're in that kind of chaotic environment, as you described it, which I think is pretty apt most of the time, you've got to be able to, you're not going to have all the answers. And, you're going to have a lot of stuff that you have to figure out. And, in order to figure out things the right way, having as much diversity of thought, background and experiences is really, really key.
And Mark, tell me, you've got a business now that's going through the motions and building. You've hired a great team. They're diverse, they're creative, etc. And as you move closer and closer to the capital event or the IPO, what changes? Because I imagine a lot changes as you get closer to that.
Yeah, I think the obvious one is that you need more experts. You tend to need people that are narrower and deeper in their roles because you're becoming more specialized, obviously. So that's the first thing. The leadership side is really super important as well. In both of my global tech roles, I was fortunate in that some of the early hires then, were able to step up and do really well and become, essentially the leadership team of the organizations. You have to build that out. But, that hasn't always been the case, certainly with, some of the other local startups, that wasn't the case. And then, you've got different challenges about how you bring, people in that, they have huge amount of leadership experience, but perhaps, they don't have quite that, passion, hunger, the experience, knowledge of the business that the people that, you hired early on have. So, how do you blend that together, and how do you make sure that you're, putting people in the right roles at the right time? Especially for scaling really quickly. Like, I think scaling quickly is one of the hardest things. I mean, it's better than being in a, everything's going wrong and we're in a turnaround situation, right? But like, it still has its fair share of challenges. And again, I think having that experience of having worked for organizations that, whilst they were maybe small in APAC and Australia, were big globally, has really been a help to me, because you can kind of look at the other regions in the company, right, and say, this is what sales, customer success, marketing looks like when it's 5 times as big as we are today. I've been able to do that in my last role with our UK business, for example. They're 18 months ahead, roughly twice the size. So you can kind of, learn a lot, from, experience of other regions within the company. But again, local startup, you don't have that. You're making everything up from scratch. So, all you've got is your experience from other roles, and that's never quite the same, because they're all different. The companies are different, the background different, funding team, like everything's different.
So you mentioned that journey of getting to IPO and learning off others, and now you're advising both startups and those landing in. For startups, so for those who are kind of growing without that sort of global parent, how do you kind of help them set up that reference point, or is there different people they should be leaning on to learn from, or it is like, how do they approach that? I think you're right. Learning from those who are part of your network or part of your own organization is critical and crucial. And in my career, I can't thank those who've sort of taught me or I've learned from enough. But when you're in a startup, you don't have that group. So how should they approach it?
In my case, it's essentially starting with a plan, right? So, a go-to-market plan, and to do a plan, you need to audit, what's already there. If there is something already there, if you're starting a global tech, vendor and region, obviously, your plan starts with whatever the global plan was. If it's a local one, it starts with what they've been doing to date, and you figure out what's working and what's not working. So, I tend to get really deep on the data, first and foremost, really trying to understand, the sales drivers of the business. So, I start there. Also understanding, the goals and challenges of the key, people within the business, and kind of putting those two things together to build out the picture, come up with a plan, distill that into, typically like 30, 60, 90 day objectives and priorities, and, then work through overseeing the implementation of those go-to-market initiatives or changes, and helping assist with, any hiring, that they need, or identify talent gaps within the organization. So, that's kind of how I'm approaching it now. Obviously, it's a little bit different because I'm not full time, so I'm having to focus, my time, and I can only support, two or three clients at a time currently as well. So, where we go next year is, obviously there's an opportunity to, hopefully support more clients by bringing, more specialists and, that I've worked with in my past, more A players, into the teams, that we can start to, because I'm not the expert on everything, right? I'm good at the overall go-to-market, but I'm not like a, deep subject matter digital marketing expert. So, what I hope to do is try and pull, some of those experts that I've worked with before in as well, so that, you can offer, I guess, a wider range of services and support more clients.
We've talked about the things to do, right? And I think we talk about it in the intro for the podcast. You learn from your mistakes as much as you learn from your successes, right? And I think I've got a raft of failures behind me in terms of things that have worked and not. Like, if you look back, kind of the key roles you've had, what would be the couple of areas you'd say, like, they're the things that I tried, they didn't work, but like in that sort of kernel of knowledge, or that piece that you don't do differently and try and pass on to others?
Yeah, I've reflected on that a lot recently, and I mean, I distilled that in some of that in the LinkedIn post that
Yeah.
we were talking about earlier as well. So I think some of the things, some of the things are personal to me, and some of them are I guess systematic of the kind of mistakes that global tech companies generally make, which is the things that we were speaking about earlier about lack of market localization, maybe hiring issues, rushing expansion, trying to do too much too quickly, misunderstanding the scale, or executing before you've understood the local market properly. Those types of things are, I guess, the things that systematically tend to come up very regularly, especially on the global tech companies. And they're definitely things that we've all got wrong in the past, right? No one's got a perfect hiring record. Nobody's managed to get everything localized perfectly to the market that they're operating in, I don't think, for any global tech vendor ever. So they just tend to do the things that you're always working on to an extent. And then obviously there's things that are kind of more personal to you as well, in terms of the things that are maybe more unique to your personality. So in my case, I've always had a bit of imposter syndrome. So certainly in my earlier career, I tended to lack conviction, or lack confidence in my convictions some of the time, and I would wait for too much data. Right? I think this needs to happen, or this needs to, this is what the answer is, but maybe I'm not right, and let's wait a bit longer. And 9 times out of 10, you're right first time, of course, and the delay just hurts you more. So I think those things are specific to you as an individual as well. So there's always a combination of the two, and you've got to have or you try and build a decent amount of self-awareness so that you can recognize your own weaknesses that impact your performance, as well as the things that are, as I say, systematic and common challenges for all similar businesses.
What do you reckon on that, Simon? I mean, you've been through this journey a few times yourself. I mean, what do you reckon are the failures that you learn, or you lean back in and look for the lessons and try either not to replicate it again or pass the messages on?
Yeah, well, look, I think hiring the right people. God, it's I've made some pretty silly old mistakes in hiring over the period, and I think if I reflect on some of the mistakes, and they're not bad people, I just hired them for the wrong roles, right? I kind of knew it as I was going through the process, but I needed to have somebody in place, and that's a mistake I wouldn't repeat. No way. But I think it's really interesting. I totally understand what you're talking about, Mark, in terms of imposter syndrome a little bit. I think it's not just when you're in a startup, funnily enough. It's when you join a new company. I've recently joined a new company. I've got to say, it took me 6 to 8 weeks before I had the confidence to question things that I knew were dumb. And if I reflect on that, I probably could have done it a bit faster. But at the same time, I wanted to respect the business I joined because they'd been operational for, 10, 15 years. So I think the faster I can move into a new role or a new environment without disrespecting the existing processes, I think is all the people that are running them. But I think I'm 3 months into a new gig now, and I woke up one morning a week ago and I said, look, I'm going to have to go break some shit. It's this stuff that has to change. It did take me a while to get that confidence though, and I think that's I think the more you do it, the better you get at it. I think certainly, startup in Australia, working for an American company after coming out of Salesforce, that was an interesting journey, right? Because I'd just come from a massive organization. We had 50, 60 people in the sales team I was leading, and a lot of processes. And then I joined Financial Force, and I got to say, when the day I walked in, it was a hobby, if you like, for the US business, because there were 2 people and not a whole lot of professionalism and execution. The people were good. They just weren't being led. Their boss sat, 17-hour flight away, so there's not a whole lot of oversight. So lots of different things, but you got to love it, right? You got to throw yourself in the deep end, and enjoy the people you're working with. Because if you don't enjoy the people you're working with, it's just a pain in the neck.
People are the best bit and also the biggest challenges most of the time, I think, right?
Absolutely.
And not just hiring either, right? Like hiring or promoting the wrong people, or, not doing enough to retain people that, end up leaving, that you're right. I really wish we hadn't lost that person, back then. So, it's, as you say, it's, a great team is, one of the things that makes a role, really rewarding and engaging, but, also making mistakes on either hiring, promoting, who you invest in, who you don't invest in. That's the thing that tends to cost you the most highly as well.
Yeah, I think on that side, Mark, the law of small numbers kicks you in the shins all the time. I mean, if you're running a sales org of 50 people and 2 people quit, whatever, we're still going to hit our number, it's okay. You're running a sales org of 3 people and 1 person quits, 33% of your business just walked out the door. Yeah. And you've got no one to carry that quota, and you're going to have a lead time on filling that chair. And that person, once they even hit the chair, has got a ramp time, and you just don't have coverage for it. So so as a result, like the decisions you make around keeping someone who either should move on or, I don't have enough time to develop that person. They're in the wrong chair, but I don't have another chair for them. Like all these things start to flow into the decisions you're making.
Yeah, harder in a smaller team. You're right, 100%.
Absolutely, yeah. And then all of a sudden, you're kind of held by the success level or lack of sometimes of this team. You're like, but hold on, we talked about this. If I get rid of them, it doesn't work. So I think all these things kind of come back into the mix of, you're back in that startup mentality, and you can't invest ahead of the curve. And the business will say to you, hey, look, when you start to see some success and some numbers, then we'll grow. But I need the investment to drive the success in the numbers. So, like, it's a double-edged sword, I think, in terms of it. And as a result, it goes back to what you said at the top of the hour mark. You want people who are self-starters who will work out how to go and solve the problem. And sometimes the problem isn't their job, and it's a thing that's just going to have to be done in order for us to get the success.
I was going to say, hired to run a region. I was out buying fridges and microwaves and negotiating real estate leases. And my boss in the US really didn't care about any of that stuff. He wanted to know where my number was. And you've got to just get on with it, right? And my poor old credit card got absolutely smashed when we opened that office because there was no real, no policy or process for buying things for an office. And it was kind of interesting, but I'd spend half my day doing absolutely nothing to do with growing the business, but just building the physical infrastructure so people would want to come into the office and work.
Well, Mark, we're getting to the top of our hour here and our time together, mate. So one of the things we like to wrap up, you've got a wealth of knowledge and a huge piece of experience, is really just like the top tips that you would give to someone, either, I suppose, your target market here for Australian go-to-market, like, which is, a startup or someone either being that first on ground or leading a team. Like, what are the top 2 or 3 tips you'd give them to be most successful in their role?
A lot of the people that are have founded startups, it's their first time. Not always, right, but certainly with a lot of the organizations that I'm working with. So, I would definitely it probably sounds a bit self-serving. It's not intended to be, but I would definitely say, like, make sure you work, either in a professional or personal, or have a strong network of people that have been there, seen it, and done it before, that you can talk to and work through stuff. The mistakes hurt you more than anything. So, do everything that you can to try and avoid them. I think, the other thing is, people tend to try and do too much. They take on too much or do too much too quickly. So try and dial it down, be realistic about what you can do, and do a really good job of focusing on, the top 2 or 3 things rather than trying to do like 8 or 9 different things. And thirdly, I guess, again, would just be have the confidence in your conviction. When, a lot of people are doing it for the first time, in particular founders, you often see that they don't have that confidence in your conviction that I suffered from earlier in my career, and that tends to lead to a situation where they either delay decisions or they make decisions and then change their mind very quickly afterwards, and that becomes very unstable. So those are probably the top three from my perspective.
Mate, Mark, great advice, and I think I would agree on that 100%. Like, keep your focus list short and tight. I mean, I know that's one of my key lessons out of the different roles that I've had, which is you can do less than you expect in a year and do so much more than you expect in a decade, right? And it really is about just keeping tight focus on what you want to do. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time. Simon, thank you as always. And for all of our listeners of the show, we appreciate your time. If you're watching this on YouTube, please click subscribe, click the like button down below. If you are following us on either Apple Music or Spotify or one of the other podcast platforms, please press the plus button so we can make sure we let you know when the next episode comes up. But again, guys, thank you for joining and listening to us today. Mark, thanks for your time. Simon, thank you so much. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Mark.
Cheers. Bye.